Hey, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever in the world you may be. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for being here. I am Safwan Masri, Executive Vice President for Global Centers and Global Development at Columbia University. At Columbia, our primary mission is to further global discourse and understanding through the global centers and to contribute solutions to the many issues that all of us as global citizens and as global institutions are facing. Of particular interest to us is the challenge of forced migration, which happens to cut across many of our 9 global centers in Amman, Istanbul, Nairobi, and Tunis, to name a few. Over the years, the global centers have built up a number of initiatives to try to respond to the crisis, including the establishment of the Committee on Forced Migration. The committee convenes more than 50 faculty members from across the university, and it is committed to research into the many and complex issues involved in forced migration and to engaging meaningfully in providing solutions. Toward that end, the Committee on Forced Migration has been offering a year-long series of webinars, of which today is a part, to faculty, students, and the general public. The series allows us to explore issues from within different disciplines and contexts and to meet our mission of drawing as widely as possible from the expertise and resources of the university. Today, our topic is Pandemic and Geopolitics, Politics of Nationalism and Borders. Now, we live in a world that values and depends on movement, from the axis on which our planet spins, to the daily retreat and advance of tides, to the way nations and those within need movement to fuel our globalized economy, a constant motion of both goods and people. We are so accustomed to the motion, we may not even notice it until the motion stops, as it did this past year. What does it mean to be a migrant, to have to be a migrant in an immobilized world? The enormous container ship that blocked traffic through the Suez Canal until yesterday, seriously delaying the supply of goods throughout the world, illustrates that reality. It also serves as a metaphor for the human consequences of the pandemic. The ship's name, Ever Given, almost seems scripted to signal all the lives that are so often taken for granted and left unprotected. Migrant workers trapped behind closed borders, and hundreds of thousands of people trying to escape dangers posed by climate change and by political regimes. For those sheltering at home, the world seems to have ground to a halt, but the circumstances forcing people to flee have not stopped. They have grown worse. Extreme poverty, violence, and natural disaster continue to plague the planet, and there have been no rescue packages for those affected. The repercussions of the pandemic have been most severe for those with the fewest resources, especially those without the safeguards of a secure home or nation. Despite the fact that our economy and other systems, including our food supply chain, is globalized, our responses to the pandemic have been insular and nationalistic rather than cooperative and humanitarian. Let's look at the language we use to describe the pandemic. Instead of talking about a health crisis, we have a national emergency. Instead of discussing medical research, we have a war on the virus. These phrases legitimize fear of other peoples and places and reinforce the idea of assigning blame and locating the enemy, whom we may then attack, disregarding the fact that this virus is a problem shared among all of humanity. None of us are safe until all of us are. Mutations will continue to spread in proportion to the selfishness that drives the response of wealthy nations. Refusing to share medical equipment or vaccines may make one nation or one state feel more powerful, but it only serves to make the world and that nation more vulnerable. Now, back to the Suez Canal. The resources of many nations came together ultimately to figure out a way to release that container ship, held captive between two seas and preventing the delivery of innumerable goods. Might the same urgency be applied to the human lives thrown off course and caught in circumstances beyond individual control? Let us hope that our conversation today will help determine a way forward. I thank all of you for being here today, and I will now turn to today's moderator, Professor Lisa Anderson, a dear friend and a close colleague. Professor Anderson is Special Lecturer, James D. Shotwell Professor of International Relations Emerita, and Dean Emerita at the Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. Lisa has been on the Columbia faculty since 1986, and she served as chair of the Political Science Department and as director of Columbia's Middle East Institute. After a decade as CPAS Dean, Lisa moved to the American University in Cairo, where she was provost from 2008 until 2011, when she became president until 2016. Dr. Anderson's scholarly research has included work on state formation in the Middle East and North Africa, on regime change and democratization in developing countries, and on social science, academic research, and public policy, both in the United States and around the world. Among her books are The State and Social Transformation in Tunisia and Libya, 1830 to 1980, and Pursuing Truth, Exercising Power, Social Science and Public Policy in the 21st Century. She has also published numerous scholarly articles. Lisa, I always love sharing the stage with you. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Safwan, and it is really a delight to be able to be with you and with these extraordinary colleagues. As you've suggested, we really do need to be thinking about how the pandemic has shaped global migration, or rather how the politics of the pandemic have shaped migration and mobility. Duress rarely elicits generosity, and we've seen relatively little in this moment of fear and anxiety. Increased border controls have slowed mobility, as you've pointed out, forcing billions of people into national and personal lockdowns and depriving households and communities of the resources on which their health and well-being depend, partly because of the lockdowns and partly, of course, because of the death toll that this pandemic has imposed on us. Xenophobia has flourished and fear has shaped domestic policy responses around the world. Fortunately, we have several of the world's experts to help us explore the patterns and consider the possible consequences of the effects of the pandemic on migration and migrants. Unfortunately, one of our number, Max Siegelbaum, can't be here. Co-founding editor and senior reporter at Documented, a nonprofit news site devoted to covering New York City's immigrants and the policies that affect their lives, Max has followed the impact of the pandemic on the lives of immigrants, including immigrant communities of New York hardest hit, from the Elmhurst and Corona neighborhoods of Queens to essential workers across the city. You can follow their work at documentedny.com. Even without Max, however, we have a terrific lineup. Fiona Adamson is reader in international relations at SOAS in London, a co-investigator in the European Union Horizon 2020 research project, Migration Governance and Asylum Crises, and is co-convener of the London Migration Research Group. Neeraj Kaushal, an economist and journalist by training, is professor of social policy at the Columbia School of Social Work and an expert on comparative immigration policy, and the author of an acclaimed book, Blaming Immigrants, which Daniel can show you on his screen. Daniel Naujoks, interim director of International Organization and UN Studies at Columbia School of International and Public Affairs, serves as chair of the International Studies Association section on ethnicity, nationalism, and migration studies. This is an extraordinary collection of expertise and intelligence. And it is all too timely as countries around the world struggle to both contain the virus and deal with its economic, social, and political fallout. Keep in mind that 1 in 5 workers in the United States is a migrant. The impact on domestic production of impeded mobility will be profound. So too, millions and millions of Indians working abroad were sent home, depriving their communities of much needed remittance income, while Australia's net migration is expected to be negative this year for the first time since 1945. And this will lead to the lowest population growth in a century. In other words, this really is a global set of issues. How will governments and political parties and factions, international organizations and NGOs respond to these challenges? Let's start our discussion with Daniel. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Safwan. I'm really happy to be here, and I'm sharing my screen. Can you see my screen? In my presentation, I'm going at the global level. As Professor Anderson mentioned, I direct the UN Studies Specialization here at SIPA, and I have investigated over the past year a lot how the multilateral system, the UN system, has responded to the mobility needs the world over. And to preface this, just mention that in a current research project of mine, I'm analyzing all UN development plans, and the vast majority of them actually do incorporate displacement, migration, remittances, diaspora, human smuggling, and all forms of mobility into these plans. But they do this in different ways, and this is just to illustrate a recent project of mine on the MENA region, where it's a spectrum on how many different groups, how many different entities, how many different policy sectors are affected by mobility in these plans. So what did we see during COVID? There's two things. One, even more than before, we've seen an increase in mainstreaming, integrating mobility across the UN's COVID response. And we have seen much more joint project integrated program by the UN, which if you study the UN processes such as myself, it's very interesting to see that this has further increased the collaboration among different entities of the UN. So in June last year, the Secretary General Antonio Guterres issued this policy brief on COVID-19 and people on the move, which has 4 key messages. The first message was really exclusion is costly, and in the long run, we need to include everybody. So it's a social cohesion message, which you would kind of expect from the UN from a normative point. The second message is the COVID-19 response and safeguarding the human rights of people on the move are not mutually exclusive. So we have seen an increase in nationalism, we have seen an increase in xenophobia, as both Professor Masri and Professor Anderson mentioned. And one of the key messages is, well, we have to consider the human rights-based approach and not focus on keeping our citizens safe and excluding the others. One key message, and I think that is for me, not just the UN message, but many people have learned, and again, Professor Masri has mentioned that no one is safe until everyone is safe. Us who teach migration and research migration have long argued that leaving human rights concerns and international law concerns aside, it is in the very interest of communities of destination who host migrants of all legal statuses, including undocumented migrants, to extend education rights, healthcare, access to the justice system. Why? Because the pandemic, as one example, doesn't stop at the legal status. People who are undocumented, who get sick, who can't get tested, who can't have access to certain remedies and vaccines will infect the rest of the population. So even if you don't care about migrants, right, it is in your own interest to make everybody safe, including the most vulnerable, including those without legal status. And the last point is that people on the move are part of the solution. That counts for immigrant and diaspora populations. And we know that remittances have decreased, and sometimes because diaspora populations, immigrant populations have decreased, so their potential to remit has increased. But where they could, they've actually increased what they could send, because we know that remittances are counter-cyclical. If there's a greater need, as by the COVID-induced economic shocks, the diaspora actually contributes more, and many of these cash-starved economies, and I'm working in Moldova right now, a small country between Ukraine and Romania, they have really relied on these remittances. but also in immigration context. Not just nurses and doctors, not just immigrants who do research on vaccines and other medical research, but essential workers who work as delivery people outside, who work at the cashier at the supermarkets, right? All these people who were taken for granted now have taken this essential worker status and increased the positive perception of migration. Just a quick run through the Global Humanitarian Response Plan, which the UN has mounted last year, which was supposed to raise $6.7 billion US, 1.5 billion of which exclusively for regional refugee response plans and migration response plans. And it has many different aspects on the migration response, including a COVID-19 migration health evidence portal run by the IOM and many others. So where do we go from here? Just a few factors to consider how to go forward. On the one hand, and this is all about what increases our multilateral cooperation on migration. So as Professor Masri said, for the Suez Canal, right, we needed more countries and stakeholders to come together. Now I'm first focusing on those factors that increase cooperation on migration in the future. Because of the expected recession, we may see an increased need of mobility. Mobility is an adaptation strategy, which actually helps to overcome limitation in the national economy. So increased needs for migration. To some extent, we've seen positive mobility perceptions. Migration are perceived better, and I talked about that a minute ago. We also have seen, that's a little side note, new forms of mobility. For example, several countries, including Aruba, have created telework visa, where they now say, this could be your office, and who would not like to work at that beach, right? They offer special visas for people who now are remote workers who go to Aruba or to Bermuda or any other countries, and many other countries trying to think about how to use this global workforce that is not tied to a workplace. We have seen a stronger focus on multilateral solutions, not just on migration, but in general, there has been a push, especially at the agency level, UNDP, IOM, ILO, and other agencies, but also with specific focus on migration. I mentioned a few things, how migration has been mainstreamed, integrated into the response. And we are talking about comprehensive reforms. For example, the healthcare system. Many of us now know the limitation of healthcare systems. So if you reform the entire system, that's an entrance, it's an entry for specific lobbying on migrant inclusion, refugee inclusion, undocumented migrant inclusion. On the other hand, there are factors that limit or may limit how we work together on migration. And one is that the global recession may actually lead to decreased funds, which then for global projects and global programming means less funding. We also see increased other priorities. We know that because of the pandemic, trends we have seen over the last 10 years, 20 years of decreasing poverty rates, decreasing hunger rates, etc., now are reversed. More people enter extreme poverty, which means our focus may shift away from mobility concerns towards more pressing basic needs. And I mentioned the positive perceptions of migrants, but there are also negative perceptions. Some people frame migrants now as carriers of disease, and we have this xenophobic expressions. Of course, in the US, there's been, and many other parts, there's anti-Asian sentiments, which have been there before, but because of certain political framings of the China virus, etc., we've seen an increase of certain xenophobic tendencies. And of course, to some extent, this has led to a national vaccine nationalism, to more increased nationalism and withdrawal from multilateralism. The Trump administration, which now is in history, luckily, has withdrew from the WHO. It withdrew from the Paris Agreement, to some extent connected to the pandemic, to some extent not. But the question is, how will this go forward? And my last point is, we're discussing often a theme called building back better, which comes from the disaster relief, where we think if a tsunami wipes out a village and all the houses are gone, if we build back, we don't build the same houses, we want better houses, better infrastructure, stronger infrastructure. And now we don't talk about building back, but building forward. So in this new environment, where we think about this chaos, this crisis that we're having is a fertile ground for policy entrepreneurs the UN, academics, activists, policymakers to use this chaos that we have right now to re-establish new ideas. And again, that's not taken for granted that we will emerge with a stronger focus on human rights, on inclusion, on mobility, etc. But if the right people get the right ideas and introduce them into these policy-making processes, I think we can actually have a much better, much more equal and inclusive system on governing migration in the future. Thanks for listening. I look forward to hearing my colleagues and to discussing with all of you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Let me remind the audience that if you have any questions for any of the panelists, in this instance, Daniel, you should put them in the Q&A function and we'll get to them shortly. I have some questions, but I will hold them until we're in our question period. But Daniel, thank you very much for a provocative discussion. Neeraj, the floor is yours, or rather the screen is yours.
Neeraj, you need to unmute.
Oops, I'm sorry. So I repeat myself. Thank you, all of you, for starting this very interesting conversation. For my initial remarks, let me just focus on three things. The first one, and these are all short-term impacts of COVID-19 on immigration and on responses to it. So as everybody just pointed out, that we saw a sudden decline in, or actually stop of global mobility. In the initial months, at least in the US, we saw State Department showed 90 to 99% decline in mobility. And we saw that everywhere, same thing happening everywhere. Countries that needed to bring their migrant workers back, they often had to start some special flights for that. So we saw, as expected, a decline in mobility. That included migration as well. My second point actually flows from the first point, which is that as a result of this immediate decline or stop of inflow of workers, Western countries that depend on migrant workers for several essential services, they felt acute labor shortages. These shortages are prevalent in many sectors, but were most severe in agriculture and healthcare. So countries responded, countries that have often been very reluctant in allowing immigrants, and countries where xenophobia had been rising for several years, they responded in a very interesting manner. For instance, we saw in May, Italy granting temporary 6 months amnesty to about 600,000 undocumented workers. We saw Germany airlifted 40,000 foreign farm workers in April, and another 40,000 in May from Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Ukraine for picking fruits and vegetables. In Germany, we also saw the government lifted the length of period for which agriculture workers could stay. Again, the same thing happened for foreign doctors. There was genuine concern and need for foreign doctors. Therefore, many countries decided to put aside the credentials that normally are required to pass medical licensing exams, and they granted temporary visas and permissions to work as doctors. That happened in the US as well. In New York, especially, the mayor allowed some foreign doctors who were in the first year of their residences to work. In the US, again, on the one side, while we saw President Trump, making statements to restrict immigration, at the same time, he also lifted restriction on H-2A visas around that time. So we saw this interesting response to immigration. On the one hand, they wanted to restrict immigration. On the other hand, the critical need of foreign workers in certain industry was felt very severely by governments. And in response to that, they lifted certain restrictions that they would not lift during non-pandemic times. And this kind of drives home the point about the role immigrants play in Western countries and also in Eastern rich countries, and provide several important lessons for policy. But before that, let me just point to a third point that I wanted to make, which is that how did countries responded to services that they provide for migrants? So in the US, we've seen that the stimulus packages initially were focused most on the citizen population. Then some were provided for non-citizen, but undocumented were generally out of this. So on the one hand, we wanted undocumented workers to be here to pick vegetables and fruits and do the essential services. There was this complete lack of look at their needs. As a result, a lot of the civil rights community came forward and provided for some of their needs. And my final point is, how did migrants responded to? So, we just heard about remittances, and there was this fear that COVID will lead to, because it's restricting migration, is also going to lead to a decline in remittances. And IMF had a report out, World Bank had a report out where they said there'll be a decline of 20% in remittances. So there were all these reports out, but at the end of it, what we find is remittances have stayed where they were, or in some cases have actually declined. Increased. So that's an interesting phenomena. And I think part of it, many people are thinking that part of it is because Western countries gave impressive stimulus packages for their populations. I think part of it is also because migrants who were used to using informal channels of sending money back home, they decided to had to use formal channels now. And the second could be they themselves felt that there's a more severe need of funding for their families back home. So it's a very complicated story, but I think the short-term story that we get from COVID is that mobility stopped, need for foreign workers increased, and we responded in a very mixed way in terms of how to cater for these people who we think are very important for the day-to-day life of Western countries. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you very much. A complicated picture indeed. We'll have to come back to some of these, the extent to which remittances didn't decline even if mobility had. It's sort of hard to square that circle. And then, of course, connected to some of Daniel's observations about where people can work when they're not working where they ordinarily had. But before we do that, Fiona, why don't you expand a little bit on what you think has been happening in Europe?
Okay, thanks, Lisa, and thanks, Safwan. It's great to be part of this panel. I thought I'd reflect on how the crisis has exacerbated ongoing trends in Europe before the pandemic. And I wanted to focus on 3 areas where I think the pandemic has kind of created a layered crisis that in some ways, I don't want to be too pessimistic, but has accelerated existing trends. And those 3 crises are the Brexit crisis of Britain leaving the European Union, a general crisis in the EU around migration, but also a legitimacy crisis in the EU, but also the Eastern Mediterranean crisis between Turkey and Greece. And I think in all of those areas, they were already ongoing crises, and then the pandemic and its relation to migration has kind of accelerated the existing trends of restricted migration policies and the interaction between kind of northern and southern countries. So to start with Brexit, and I'll just discuss each of these in a minute, I think we have to remember that the COVID-19 pandemic exactly overlapped with Britain leaving the EU. So we had the Johnson government that came into power in December 2019, and the EU withdrawal agreement went from January 2020 to December 31st, 2020. So we had this overlap. And so Britain was already rethinking its migration policy. So already in November, there was legislation put forward to end free movement between the European Union and the UK. Fast forward to this year, and because Britain has withdrawn from the EU, Britain is also obviously out of the common migration and asylum policy area. So even just last week, there was a proposal to radically change Britain's asylum policy, where there's an attempt to prevent irregular migrants who arrive in Britain from being able to claim any asylum whatsoever. And I think that's partly prompted by the general hostile environment in Britain, but also has been accelerated by COVID-19 because there was a sense that irregular migration was also a health issue, as asylum seekers were staying in hotels or in detention centers. And so this combination of the general political climate and the pandemic and Brexit is leading to more and more restrictive policies. And they're already talking about, for example, outsourcing and externalization and so forth. Now, this is not too different actually from the discussion in the European Union as well. Again, I think the so-called migration and refugee crisis in 2015, 2016 had already put some of these dynamics into motion. But the COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated the sense of crisis. Not only were there border closures, obviously, across Europe in 2020, which already kind of called into question one of the benefits of the EU, of freedom of movement. But in addition, you see in the past year an attempt to have a new pact on migration and asylum, which actually increases externalization, increases border control at the European frontier, and increases already existing dynamics of putting emphasis on, for example, return agreements between the EU and migration sending or transit states. So this pattern of externalizing and outsourcing migration policy from the EU to neighboring countries is only increasing. And I think, the new pact will also include things like enhanced medical screening and so forth at the border of the EU. So again, enhancing and kind of exacerbating existing trends. And finally, the EU policy also interacts with other geopolitical crises, such as the Eastern Mediterranean crisis between Greece and Turkey. Obviously, the EU-Turkey deal in 2016 has affected relations between Greece and Turkey, but this tension around migration has also interacted with a general tension in the Eastern Mediterranean around pipeline issues, around new alliances with Turkey and Libya, and so forth. And so we see, for example, next week, the EU will be going to Ankara to try to negotiate further with Turkey as Turkey kind of strategically uses migration issues to relate to Europe, but also that it has, in fact, more leverage because of the crisis around the pandemic in Greece and elsewhere, where camps in Greece are filled to overflowing. The EU is committing more money to build more camps in Greece currently, but the pandemic has also exacerbated these dynamics. So all of this means that migration, I think, has become much more of a geopolitical issue, an issue of diplomacy and high politics, all having quite negative effects to the most vulnerable migrants, which I can talk about more in the Q&A, but I think I'll leave it here for now.
Thank you very much. These were a fascinating set of comments, and I urge everyone who has questions to post them to the Q&A. But let me start with a question of my own. Daniel, you say that the UN says that no one is safe until everyone is safe. And there's been quite a lot of rhetoric like that. And there's also been, as certainly in the United States, a lot of attention to essential workers and how important it is that we care for. And of course, as we know, certainly in the United States, and it appears this is true elsewhere as well, many of these essential workers are migrants, and many of them are undocumented. One might imagine that there would be a sort of pointed attention to that. That, in other words, even the UN would say it is important to provide access to services, even to those who are irregular, even to those who are undocumented, and so forth. And yet, as Fiona points out, on the contrary, there seems to be a policy regime in many countries, which is to say, these are the dangerous people, we'll airlift a few people in to pick our apples, but we're basically, hostile to the idea that they would have any standing prerogatives in the country and so forth and so on. How do we reconcile the fact that there's this very, no one is safe until everyone's safe, and we're, committed to our essential workers, and we're going to clap for our healthcare workers and so forth and so on. Many, many of whom are migrants, and many, many of whom are undocumented migrants. And at the same time saying, these are the scary people. How do we think about that? And maybe, Daniel, we can start with you at the international level, but I'd be curious to know how you, Fiona and Neeraj, try and reconcile or think about that. It's probably not reconcilable.
Thanks, Lisa. I mean, I think the short answer is I don't think it's easy to reconcile. It's an inherent tension that will not go away that easily. And there's always different, we all know that at the national level, at the global level, we have a heterogeneous discourse. And we always have this part of securitizing migration. We always have had these people who, and again, before the pandemic, long before the pandemic, we have had, and one of the recent examples I remember is when the migrant caravans came through Mexico towards the US about, I think 3 years ago. President Trump said, oh, and they're also a health risk. Again, out of the blue without any knowledge. And that's the typical thing about securitizing, framing migrants, asylum seekers, refugees as a security threat, including a health security threat. We have seen that, and it extends to criminalization, etc., etc. But health has been other things. They're filthy, whatever, and you come with racist stereotypes that you mix into this. And we've seen this during the pandemic, but way before the pandemic. So I don't think it goes away that easily. But what I think we have seen is that more and more actual policymakers, I'm not talking about populists who are trying to exploit this, right? There are some politicians who will always try to stir by using these false narratives about certain immigrant groups and their health risks, right? That's unavoidable. We just can inform the public about how wrong these are. But I think a lot of policymakers who were on the fence about undocumented migrants, they first know, most people know that undocumented migrants are a fact, right? This myth about pushing all of them out is just not attainable for any democracy, any liberal democracy. So the fact that you have undocumented migrants and who may not have access to basic services is conceived a risk. So it's not that the migrants are a risk. It is the fact that they do not have access to healthcare, to education. Again, that's what people are saying. They're like, okay, if they don't have access to education either, you have these scores of youth who they haven't gone to school, and of course, then the criminal career becomes more attractive because they can't actually enter the formal labor market, right? So the entire idea about what we have about firewalls between local schools and local law enforcement and hospitals, etc., and immigration enforcement, keeping these two, I think that has been growing among reasonable policymakers. I don't have actual data that shows how many, the percentage. I think it's very hard to do that. But I think this tension between these two, the securitization and using this as a way to get rid of migrants is there. But on the positive note, I see a focus also among especially local communities like city mayors, etc., who have always been more progressive because they know their local populations, but also about policymakers at the national level, the need to actually extend services. So my hope is that with a few nudges from informed researchers and people who know actually that this is only beneficial and not negative, we can move in the right direction. But it's not a self-fulfilling prophecy. We have to actually push this a little bit.
Sorry, I think the problem is, Daniel, and I want to turn to Neeraj and Fiona on this, but the problem is that I see the policy entrepreneurs on the hostile to foreigners side of the equation. And I don't see the policy entrepreneurs that you say this is an opportunity for, which in principle, I think is true. I don't see the policy entrepreneurs trying to do that. So hold that for a minute. Think about whether you can think of a few of them while Neeraj and Fiona weigh in here. Neeraj.
So let me just express, like Daniel was saying, hope that the 1918 influenza, it started discussion on public health care. And I hope the current pandemic leads to, at least in the US, much less discrimination on healthcare. And then to the point that, Lisa, you were making about undocumented immigrants who provide for so much of our essential services, why don't we think about them? And here too, I think I'm going to take a positive, I agree with most of what you guys are saying, but I'm going to take the other side, which is that 12 years ago, when Obama came to power, in the United States, before that, he was, saying, yes, we can make them, legalize undocumented. But in the first 4 years, he just didn't even want to touch immigration. He became, in a way, the deporter in chief. That's what he was called. And the part of the reason was the administration was trying to say that, there are 12 million at that time undocumented immigration, legalizing all of them would be, they just didn't have the courage to do that. And my interpretation of that was they wanted to deport a third of them, legalize a third of them, and forget about the rest of them. That was the thinking at that time, right? And that went on for 8 years of Obama, even though they came up with DACA, in the middle of just before the 2012 elections. At least now we have Democrats having the courage to talk about legalizing. So for the first time if you look at what Obama in the first term didn't want to talk about it, Biden right from the beginning is talking about it. Whether they'll be able to do that or not is a different thing, but some of the conversation, partly because of the pandemic or partly because of the 4 years of Trump, has changed and given Democrats the courage to at least talk about legalization. And the second thing, and I hope that happens, which is about the DACA recipients, the people for whom these children who came at a younger age to this country and have now been here for a long time. So imagine someone who got DACA, the temporary permission to live here in 2012, and now it's already 8 years. 4 years of Biden, that would be 12 years. For many of the kids, it would be more than half their lives. And suddenly, so this is a very precarious and important thing, that if you don't grant these people paths to legalization, you would have them spending a big part of their life in this country and still have not been granted legalization. So they will still be in a limbo. So at some level, this has also become, at least in the case of the US, it's become a very critical thing. How do you address the legalization for the entire undocumented population, and more particularly for DACA recipients? So I think at the political level, there is some ray of hope. What actually happens, we'll see. I'll stop there.
Happy to cling to any ray of hope. Thank you very much. Fiona, what's going on in Europe?
Yeah, well, I want to agree somewhat with what Daniel said, that there have been some interesting positive developments. For example, in Italy, which has a right-wing government, there has been some regularization and amnesties of, for example, agricultural workers. And that I think has been directly because of the pandemic, for the very reasons that have been discussed, that political leaders want to know who's in their country because it is a health issue. And also in the UK, for example, there has been vaccination programs for everyone, even if one has irregular status. How much that's being utilized, I'm not sure, because there is still a climate of fear, but officially anyone can get vaccinated. Even with the most recent proposal of restricting asylum and not allowing anyone who comes to the UK irregularly to receive asylum, at the same time, there's an increase in asylum opportunities for those who are given refugee status outside of the UK. So there's an attempt to increase legal channels for asylum while heavily restricting irregular migration. And I think that is the key issue with all these dynamics, that it's the irregular migration and the sense that the pandemic has increased the concern about having a population that is in the gray economy and so forth, even while it's needed economically. So there is this tension, but I think it's playing out basically in increasing the inequalities in terms of different types of migration policy, of opening up some more legal avenues. In the UK also will be a point system and so forth, but actually it's for the most precarious that things are still, I think, increasingly difficult.
Daniel.
Just one short addition. I mean, all of us agree that the focus on irregular, undocumented migrants is important because they often are the most vulnerable. But I think we should not forget that migration is much broader. And also there are many other migrants who are vulnerable too, who are not undocumented, right? There's a lot of exploitation, a lot of not having access to healthcare systems for many people. And I also see a focus of many governments, be that governments of origin, thinking about social policies for diaspora, or be it for countries of destination who host immigrants, about including migrants more broadly into health systems. Right? Again, so the undocumented migrants have always a special role in the policy discourse. They're often highly politicized and securitized, and because the ideas about we don't authorize these people to come in, etc. So the right wing and law and order people are often very scared about that. But leaving that aside for a moment, I think it's also important to note that there are these tendencies. And again, I don't have data how many policymakers, how many actually push for that, but I see that in Europe, in Germany, where I originally come from, my country of origin, but also in UN discussions where I'm privy to supporting UN programs in Eastern Europe right now, where this is very much at the forefront, where the UN is working with governments to think about reforming healthcare systems, and in that reform process really have the reminder we need to make them accessible either for immigrants, or think about what it means for immigrants, temporary immigrants, diaspora populations, etc., returnees, so the entire cycle of migrants. I think that's an advance over previous discussions where we know that social security systems, healthcare systems are very nationalized, right? They often do not consider transnational processes. And now, because of the pandemic, because of return movements, massive return movements, more people now think about how can we build these social security systems that take into account cross-border movements better. So I think, again, how this will pan out in the future, we have to see, but I see positive developments.
Okay, thank you very much. I do think that one can imagine some of those kinds of policy proposals becoming part of a discussion that however we think about the provision of healthcare, it should be as mobile as the people who are going to need it. So, kind of how do we conceptualize that and so forth. I'm still very concerned about our undocumented, the most vulnerable, the most precarious, because in fact, at least in New York, they are the people who were worst affected by the pandemic. So we still haven't solved our problem entirely by saying that people who are traveling on papers of some kind or another are going to have access to healthcare, but that's certainly an improvement, it does seem to me. So that discussion opening, I think, would be really quite worthwhile. We do have a question I want to pose pretty much to all of you from your perspectives. It's from someone in Afghanistan who wants to know how the world, or perhaps Europe or the United States or the UN or somebody, can help countries like Afghanistan confront a pandemic like this. Are there things that we should be thinking about? So we tend to think about our most affected communities in New York City because that's where we are. But what about affected communities in places like Afghanistan? How should the international community be thinking about that? Maybe Neeraj, you want to start? You were not muted.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think the best way to address COVID would be the end of COVID, right? I mean, this is the migration would pick up again once COVID ends. So we just are waiting for that. And at the moment, countries, Western countries, I think, have an obligation to provide for vaccine in developing countries, in poor countries, because it's either herd immunity or vaccination that's going to be a solution for this. And in some countries, I think a big part of India, people are developing herd immunity. But again, the solution is vaccines. So far, what we've seen is basically struggle within rich countries to keep the vaccine for themselves. In the US, what I'm told is very soon we will have an oversupply of the vaccine, where many countries in the world have not even seen any vaccine. And how do we send this vaccine to these countries where it's available at cheap or at free prices? That would be one of the things that the Western countries have to undertake. And secondly, I mean, what we've seen in the US and in many other countries is this doubt about the vaccine. And much of those doubts have actually reduced over time as people see increasing vaccination and fewer negative effects. But I think we will see that happening a lot in developing countries as well. Skepticism about the vaccine, and the best way is to provide. We can't do much about the skepticism except for providing more information, but we can at least address the supply end of the vaccine, and that hasn't happened. So while we talk about all kinds of inequalities growing in the global economy, this is one of the severe inequality of access to vaccine, availability of vaccine in developing countries, that I think we need to address.
Fiona, do you have any thoughts on what the Europeans are doing or might be doing?
Yeah, I don't think they're doing too much, but there is an I mean, I completely agree on the vaccines. There are 2 points that I would raise. One is that actually, I think many have observed that some developing countries have actually been doing better than developed countries in managing the pandemic. And I think that's something we have to remember, that actually many countries were doing better than Europe in the early days of the pandemic. And also many countries have more experience with public health systems that are kind of very localized and that have experience with immunization. So I think that's one positive thing. The other way in which this intersects with what's happening in Europe is how migration issues have become tied to aid packages. And this has both negative and positive effects. That the EU, and also in terms of bilateral aid, is increasingly tying aid to migration control in countries in the periphery, which may be a negative thing, but it also gives those countries leverage in terms of bargaining power with Europe. And so one could see that just as states such as Turkey and other states have used Europe's interests in restriction to kind of leverage that to get aid packages, that could be a dynamic that plays out also in relation to vaccines and public health and so forth.
What about our international organizations?
And just a little footnote for the academics on the call, Professor Adamson published a really interesting article on migration diplomacy a little more than a year ago that actually talks about how states use migration as a diplomacy tool. There's a little plug here because she's not doing herself. The question from Abdul Wali Karimi, it seems to me it's also about, as he says, the negative impacts on economic, social, and political development. What's the solution, right? And I don't think you'll find an easy answer from anyone in the world, right? These are the key core questions. How can we recover from the knock-on effects of the COVID crises, which often exacerbate existing challenges in the justice system, in our economies, etc. So in Afghanistan, of course, with the ongoing conflict and exacerbated again by I don't think anybody has the silver bullet to tell you this is how to go about that. I'm sorry. And we at SIPA here, of course, many of my colleagues and myself who work on sustainable development, I work with the UN, and the UN is trying to think about how to, as I mentioned in my brief presentation earlier, build forward better. So how can we reimagine building economies, being political systems that emerge and not just bring us to the same level we were before, but beyond that. And in theory, that is a great vision. In practice, of course, it is much, much harder to do because it needs, that's the entire thing about development. How do you develop the economy? How do you develop social systems, etc.? It's highly complex. And the best thing is, of course, you need resources, right? We need all the resources, but we need to envision how a peaceful society, and Professor Anderson here has worked a lot on state formation in post-conflict areas. So I guess she has some insights about how maybe peace and prosperity in Afghanistan can flourish. But and we've seen the peace talks right now that were going on last week or started last week or the week before. I think it's highly complex, and you will not find an easy answer to these things. From the UN's perspective, and all of us who work at this global level and from a global framework's perspective, using local knowledge, having a human rights-based approach, empowering all populations. We have seen that a gendered approach is really important. We've seen that in the discussions between the Taliban and the Afghan government and the UN and other donors were heavily male-dominated, right? So a lot of criticism has been raised about how to do these processes in a more gender equitable fashion. And so, but again, these are broad questions that are so complex that you really need to focus on different aspects of it to work on them. So that's just my a little academic, little fluffy answer, but I think it's really important.
I have another question for you, Daniel, from our attendees. It sort of flips around this question that I ask about Afghanistan. It suggests that a number of the countries in the world, including the United States and China, are pretty much starting a rhetoric about how we did a good job and we did fine and so forth and so on. Perceiving, as the question has it, their response is better without an organization like WHO. WHO just got in the way, so forth and so on. Insofar as that becomes a sort of China did better without WHO, the United States did better without WHO, what does that mean for the future of the WHO?
No, thanks. That's it's a very good question, and I'm actually teaching exactly that question next week in my class on UN globalization and COVID-19. So that we don't know exactly what this future may bring, but from my perspective, I think so. There's rhetoric, right? And China and the US have this feud, and the WHO came in the middle of that. Especially under the Trump administration. And overall, the US government has a strong fear of China. Right? There's a strong focus on China will take over the world. You can think about it what you want, but I think it's a little exaggerated. So the WHO has proven extremely relevant. There has been research, and I just attended a conference last week, which has shown public perceptions of the WHO, and most civilians didn't know about the WHO before. With the pandemic, the WHO has gained this extreme expert status, right? Could they have done a better job? Maybe, but we also, those of us who study international organizations know that an UN entity or a specialized organization such as the WHO can't just go out and do stuff, right? There are a lot of political ramifications, a lot of things they have to do. They're not just an actor who does things. So I think the expert knowledge that the WHO has done, the crisis management, bringing countries together, has actually strengthened multilateralism. Not across the board, there have been criticisms. There have always been calls for why do we need multilateral cooperation? But I see, again, if I look at this question more globally, if I look at how India and India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi and others have actually lauded the efforts, how many people have called for a stronger WHO, for a more cooperation on this, where the vaccine distribution, which has been very much determined by nationalism, but we have seen calls and some pushes by the UN to actually make this more equitable. The UN doesn't have really a whip to put countries, especially strong hegemonic countries like the US and Russia and China, into their place. They can't tell them to do things, right? That's not how the UN works. Unfortunately or fortunately, it's just a matter of fact. But we have seen, at least I have seen, a lot of strengthening of our understanding about multilateral solutions. And I think, again, we will see the WHO getting on top of that with more funding, a stronger role. And we can learn from that. I think we all can, we now know that the inherent limitations in the UN's response are partly because of the Security Council, which is a political body, it's not an implementation body, and inadequacy. But at the implementation level, UNDP, WHO, many of the entities have done an amazing job on the ground for vulnerable populations to cater to the needs, people in camps, people who are excluded from societies. There's a lot of real good benefits that the UN has been doing that can be showcased to donors, to the global community. And I think we'll get stronger out of that.
Okay, thank you very much. I have a couple of questions now. I'd actually like to turn to Safwan, if I might, because there are countries between Europe and Afghanistan, and several of them are in the Middle East, and they have both a national population that they worry about and, of course, significant refugee populations. So can you tell us a little bit about how things like distribution of vaccines and so forth and so on is going on there, whether the international organizations are supporting that just as an empirical matter. And then I have a question that I'd like to have you and Neeraj both weigh in on, and that's the link between the pandemic and hate crimes against Asians, particularly in the United States, but not only here. So Safwan, you can take any of and all of that.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you to all of you. I've been listening with just fascinated by the perspectives that you're bringing into this, and I have my own questions, which, if time allows, I will also share with you. So to your first question, Lisa, and as you know, I'm in Jordan. I'm in Amman, speaking today, where I've been during this past year of pandemic and lockdown. And in Jordan, as you pointed out, as is the case in a number of neighboring countries, you have very large refugee populations. I have to say that from what I have seen, the vaccination distribution and administration in refugee communities has been quite effective. But I should also point or be more specific and say in designated refugee communities, meaning in refugee camps, right? So very early on in Jordan, the country received vaccines that would be distributed and administered in Syrian refugee camps. That came early on and continues to come throughout the year. And I think it's being done in a very effective and efficient way through international organizations, but also, of course, with the support and partnership of the local government. The problem is when you have those who do not have refugee status. Okay, so again, we go back to the issue of the illegal migrants, right? And I think it is fair to say that in countries like Jordan and Lebanon, there are probably more Syrian displaced individuals who are not officially refugees because they did not register in refugee camps, that is, but sort of found their way into urban centers. And I worry about those communities because they are not qualified to register the way that somebody who is a legal resident or a citizen is able to register and then get the vaccine. So that's an issue. But while we're in the region also, you see a lot of, sort of contradictions, right? So next door to Jordan, you have Israel, which has led the way internationally in terms of vaccinating its population meaning Israeli citizens, regardless of their ethnicity or religion. But you have next door in the occupied territories, in the Palestinian territories, people who have really struggled for a number of reasons, including, of course, the failure of their own leadership to get the required vaccinations. So what happens in a situation like that, where you have two populations not only living side by side, but integrated and interdependent in terms of their work and their study and their daily lives that are being treated differently. Now, recently, Israel started at least vaccinating Palestinian workers who enter into Israel on a daily basis in the tens of thousands. And that's been a slow process of vaccinating them, but it is driven also by what Daniel was saying earlier. Even if you don't care about those individuals, it is to your benefit to have them vaccinated because, what good is it if everybody who is a citizen is vaccinated, but then those who come and study or come to work are not vaccinated. So, that to me, the refugee population, I think, is a very, very interesting one, just because, as we know, on a worldwide basis, you have at least twice as many individuals who are forcibly displaced, and then you have those who are forcibly displaced and enjoy a refugee status. You're muted, Lisa.
I know, I don't want to interrupt you, but then I just want to join the conversation. Do you have any comments on the question of discrimination against Asians? Because we can turn that to Neeraj too.
Yeah, I mean, that is a very, very problematic thing. And for us who are involved in the university administration in New York, it's something that we are dealing with and battling with. And Lisa and Daniel and Neeraj, and I'm not sure what the situation is like in the UK, Fiona, but we've had colleagues who have been accosted because of their Asian outward appearance. There was an incident on Broadway, not far from campus, just a few days ago, and of course, students. So I think that kind of xenophobia has been there for a long time, and perhaps, as we saw in the case of Black Lives Matter and the George Floyd moment last week, there was nothing new about it. It was sort of a resurfacing of deeply ingrained problems of racism that we face in the United States, and that have been there for a long time, and that have been fueled, I think, by the former President Trump and his administration. And I think what we see today is um, an escalation of anti-Asian racism that has existed for a very long time, and I think it is fueled again. I mean, and I think it's very fair to blame it on the former president and his rhetoric, for a whole year or almost a whole year during the pandemic. He did not refrain from, blaming China and calling the virus the Wuhan virus and the China virus. And so I do think that a lot of that is rooted in that kind of racist rhetoric that has come from the very top. How do we deal with this and how do we combat it? I think, at least at universities, we have a responsibility to raise awareness and to project from our campus environments into the world means and ways and knowledge, if you will, and raising awareness of the danger that is inherent in any kind of racism.
Thank you. Thank you. Neeraj, you said you've done some research in this field.
Yeah, let me just, I agree with, thanks, Safwan, for, very pointed remarks on this racism against Asians that we see now. We, about a year ago, concerned with this data, with this information, we wanted to do some systematic research, partly because most of the time when you get these reported instances, people who are most vulnerable would report, others won't. And we wanted to actually check, is it because of COVID or is it something else that's going on? So we did this nationally representative surveys with experiments in that we had people prime them with information of part of the treatment group where we gave them information and asked them questions about how they were affected by COVID, and then asked about their views on people from various ethnicity. And the second group was not primed with any information but asked of those views, and we found that people who were primed with information about COVID, about how they were affected, they were more antagonistic, their preferences, they showed more prejudice towards Asians, East Asians in particular. And we also found, which is something that we don't hear much, is there was a heightened discrimination of Hispanic, Latinx population in the US. And we see that in social arenas in our experiment, we also see that in workplace. And I think some of the things that we learned from this was we found that people who were living in places there that are more affected by COVID were more likely to have these negative attitudes. But we also found that people who themselves were affected by COVID, themselves or their family were affected by COVID, they had more empathy towards these groups. So there's this there's this interesting dynamic you see here, where you see that those who are themselves affected have become more have more empathy towards the minorities. And I think the other thing that we found was the point that, again, Safwan, you were talking about the role that President Trump has played in this whole narrative. Throughout last year, he was using words like Kung flu or Wuhan crisis and China crisis to describe COVID-19. One of the questions that we asked, and this was a longitudinal panels in the sense that we first visited them in March and then we went back to them in August. And we asked this question: do you think using terms like Wuhan crisis and Kung flu are racist? And a large number of our respondents actually said they don't think it was racist. In March, by August, while they had gone through the pandemic and the country has suffered it, a lot of them had begun to think differently. But you can see a whole of this narrative. And we also found a lot of partisan in the sense that people who voted for President Trump in 2016 had far more racist views than those who did not vote for him. We expect that, but in this data, which is longitudinal, and we went through these experiments, it was very sad to see how the pandemic and the all these racial prejudices that we now see and their negative impacts have been caused by some of these political narratives. I'll stop there. Thanks.
I think it's fascinating that people who had actually been affected by COVID were more empathetic, and I wonder what that tells us about the virus or what it tells us about the healthcare workers of this country and people who are caretakers in general. But we can discuss that. I do want to know from Fiona whether that same dynamic appeared in the UK or Europe of a sort of anti-Asian expressions of probably deeper discrimination and bias, but certainly people seemed in the United States to find themselves in a permissive environment.
Yeah, definitely. And I completely agree with Safwan that Trump's rhetoric has had impacts around the world, including the UK. And the language that was used around the pandemic also filtered into the UK and interacted with kind of a xenophobic climate in general, with Brexit and so forth in the UK. So certainly I don't have the type of data that Neeraj has in terms of numbers, but certainly the effect of the problematic rhetoric has filtered across the globe, I think, but definitely the UK and Europe.
Thank you for that. Safwan, I'm going to let you ask the last couple questions if you'd like to. So you said that you had some questions that you wanted to offer up, so why don't you feel free?
Thank you, Lisa. I mean, I think so much has been addressed, but maybe to throw out a couple of things that can help us perhaps, come towards, recap, if you will, and bring it to closure. I was particularly interested, Neeraj, by your references to the end of COVID, right? And that so much of what we're facing today hopefully would come to close at the end of COVID. So it's sort of a couple of things came to my mind. Do we see an end of COVID in sight, right? And even if we do at some point and it turns into an endemic and we learn how to live with it and so on and so forth, it's almost certain that we will hit another crisis at some point in the future. There will be another pandemic. And so, how do we deal with many of these questions that have to do with inequity, that have to do with migrants and displacement in that kind of a geopolitical environment that we have been discussing, so that we're better equipped to have a better world post-COVID and are better prepared for the next crisis. And maybe I'll throw in another question with that, because it's not just to Neeraj and anyone, including you, Lisa, and that is in the context of diplomacy, and as we have seen over the past couple of decades, the waning of America's position in the world and its moral authority and so on. I'm very interested in hearing what you have to say about how the United States has fared or is faring in terms of vaccine distribution elsewhere in the world, and how Russia and China may have entered the scene to try to fill a gap. And, for example, last week, the Colombian ambassador in Washington spoke glowingly of Russia and China, thanking them for what they are doing to provide countries that don't have access to vaccines, whereas the United States is sort of falling behind. We look at the politics, Fiona, within Europe and everything around AstraZeneca, right? Which to a very large extent has been politically motivated, and given the EU's contract with AstraZeneca and the much more rapid distribution in the UK versus Europe. So those are sort of the two themes that you can take in any direction that you would like. Sort of post-COVID, next pandemic, how do we prepare ourselves and how do we manage in that? And then the US, UK, Europe, China, Russia with regards to vaccine politics. So anyone? Neeraj? Yeah.
I can start with that. I have some random thoughts. I don't necessarily have the answer for all of them. I think
My
both
questions are random, so that's okay.
I mean, these questions are very important. I think vaccine passport is coming. Many countries are talking about it for international travel. That is going to happen, and you will see a lot of conversation in countries about what vaccines allow you to have a passport. There should be some kind of an international arrangement by countries to address this issue as to how do you assure countries that are receiving migrants whether they have vaccine or not. And this would, as you can expect, countries where vaccination is going as a full-fledged drive would increase mobility across those countries. But countries that don't have vaccines, you actually see, where you also see, because of demographic and economic forces, a much larger mobility. You will see that too, the increase would be much less and slow from those countries. The second thing that's going to happen is that we've seen the airlines industry has created due to pandemic. How does that revive with these vaccine passports and mobility increasing? We see that mobility within countries is increasing, but many of these issues are going to impact future mobility. And we're not really talking about mobility of migration, immigration, which actually all of us study, where we want to see the impact of immigration in reducing inequality and needs of receiving and sending countries. So I'm not talking about that. I'm just simply talking about mobility, which is for tourism, for economic reason, for business reasons. I think you'll see a pickup of mobility in Western countries, and much slower, at least from the south to the west, because they still haven't received vaccine. To the second issue of how the US has done in terms of distributing the vaccine, I think so far it has had a very not had a very exemplary response to distributing vaccine as a leader, as a global leader which has access to a lot of vaccine. And I would say some developing countries have done better. For instance, India has done better. A lot of the vaccine is being produced there, so you would probably see a lot of export of vaccine from India to African countries and South Asian countries. We also hear China in the initial months was actually, has done, because of the fear that the vaccine was not likely to be accepted. They were more liberal on that. So US has to step up to that level. And it's kind of feels a little sad in the sense that we started talking about exporting vaccine, giving vaccine to other countries only when we have excess supply. So it's, that's where I hope Biden takes a more proactive role in this, and US emerges as a more kind and a generous leader at this stage. I guess that's what we need during a pandemic. Similarly, European countries have to look beyond themselves, because as we know that this is a health issue, as you had pointed out, Safwan, yourself. You can't really address it unless you address it globally. It cannot be addressed by each country individually. It has to be a global solution. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Fiona, any last words on these issues?
I'll just be very brief that I mean, I'm a bit divided myself, because I would like to have the optimism of Daniel, and I would like to hook on to kind of all the positive developments in terms of some of the discourse at the global level. So I think we all want that. But I'm going to end even by still being slightly pessimistic, because I do unfortunately see the trends in the other direction in terms of more bilateralism rather than global coordination, and effects on growing inequalities that I don't think are being prioritized by national governments. So I guess to end, I would agree with Daniel that maybe not just at the international level, but really kind of at the level of citizens, there needs to be more engagement around these issues. Because if there is one positive thing, I think in the past few years in Europe, public opinion is actually kind of ahead of some of the government reaction on. People are more pro-migration. There has been an impact of seeing frontline workers, what they've been doing during the past year. And so I think some of these policies, like state policies, are actually a bit behind public opinion. So my hope would be more on citizenship engagement rather than global governance from above, but I guess one can be optimistic and hope that both will come together in the future.
Thank you. We have 4 minutes, and I want to give the very last word to Safwan. So Daniel, you have a minute to say anything you'd like.
Okay, I'll stick to my minute. I think the questions that Safwan mentioned really talk about the overarching world order, right? And our colleague Amita Acharya, with the former president of the International Studies Associations, has really lobbied a lot for like the multipolar world. Like we don't see the classic East-West America, USSR. We don't see US as the only hegemon. It's not just China and the US. We live in this multipolar world, which has implications on how diplomacy works. And we always see that states use vaccines and development aid as a bargaining tool, right? The world is not just about, oh, I share, I'm a good country, I love a global order. There's always, in these global discussions, self-interest and politics, which on the one hand is bad, but on the other hand, it also means this interconnectedness that we see. The Suez Canal that Professor Masri mentioned at the beginning is, again, a good visualization about that we are connected. And even though we close our borders, we can do that for a time, but in the end, we need people to move, we need goods to move, we need this interconnectedness. And it is bad for the economies, for our social fabric, for everything else if we close our borders, and not just to migrants, but overall. So I think we will have more focus, maybe not global, meaning all 198 member states of the UN and 93 member states of the UN, but it may be more regional. I mean, that's another trend that we see in cooperation, bilateral, regional, minilateral, but all these can be good solutions. We don't need everything, citizenship for the world. If we find different regimes,
we won't find citizenship for the world. Safwan, you have the last word.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you. I mean, this has been just truly fascinating, and we have covered so much and so many important questions. And I wish that we could go on for another hour or two. I just want to thank you, really, for all the work that you do and for bringing these insights and these perspectives to an incredibly dynamic conversation. And Lisa, for your exceptional moderation and being able to bring out some really incredible perspectives from three wonderful colleagues. Daniel, Fiona, Neeraj, thank you so much for doing this. And thank you, Lisa. And thanks to everybody who's involved with the Committee on Forced Migration and for its continuing work, and look forward to many more events. I think we have one coming up just next week. And so be tuned, remain tuned to what's coming up in the CFM series. But thanks very, very, very much to all of you. Thank you, Lisa.
Indeed. Thank you all. This was a delight.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.